The plane hadn't even taken off, but the drama had already begun. My business partner James had settled into his first-class seat, sipping a glass of water, looking calm and composed. Everything was peaceful until she appeared. A woman with sharp eyes, an entitled glare, and a voice that could slice through steel marched down the aisle like she was royalty. Passengers glanced up, curious but soon annoyed, as her heels clicked with impatient authority. She stopped right in front of James, planted her hands on her hips, and let out a shrill accusation that made the entire cabin turn. "That's my seat," she screamed, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at him. James blinked, confused, then looked at his ticket. "This is seat 2A, he said calmly, showing her the stub. "It's mine." But the woman Karen wasn't after fairness or truth. She was after dominance. She didn't want a seat. She wanted submission. Her voice rose, echoing through first class, as she shouted about respect and how she deserved better. Flight attendants rushed in, trying to soothe her, but Karen wasn't interested in peace. She wanted a scene. She wanted the world to see her power. Only the world didn't give her the power she wanted. The passengers stared in shock, some with phones raised, recording every word. Karen accused James of lying, even tried to snatch his boarding pass from his hand. Gasps filled the cabin. James, calm as a mountain, simply leaned back, refusing to be shaken. What Karen didn't realize was that her temper was her undoing. The louder she screamed, the closer she pushed herself to a humiliating fall. By the end of that flight, she wouldn't just lose a seat, she'd lose her dignity. The morning had started off smoothly, with that calm sense of routine that comes when you've done something 100 times before. James and I had been flying together for years, always for business, and our trips had become a rhythm. He would book himself into first class. He liked the space, the silence, the luxury. I would save the company money by taking economy. Was a system that worked for both of us. He could prepare in comfort, and I didn't mind being squeezed in the back with a book and headphones. That morning at the airport, James had been in his usual good mood. He was tall, sharp-suited, and carried himself with a kind of quiet confidence that drew people's respect without him ever asking for it. He liked things calm, efficient, and orderly. I, on the other hand, tended to notice the little dramas of life more quickly, and I teased him constantly about being oblivious to chaos around him. "You'll be sipping champagne before we've even taken off," I joked as we checked in. "And you'll be fighting over elbow space," he replied with a grin. "We each get what we pay for." Security was quick, and the boarding process began with the usual announcements echoing through the gate. Families gathered their children, solo travelers scrolled on their phones, and business people like us paced impatiently, rehearsing meetings in their heads. Nothing about that morning hinted at the storm about to hit us. When they called first class to board, James gave me a nod and disappeared into the jet bridge. I followed later with the economy crowd, slowly shuffling down the narrow aisle. As always, I glanced up toward the wide seats at the front. There was James, already seated, his jacket neatly folded, and a glass of water in hand. He caught my eye, gave me a thumbs up, and I laughed before continuing toward the back. It was ordinary, peaceful, just another flight. Then she appeared. First, I noticed her from a distance, a woman in her 40s, well-dressed but with an expression that carried more arrogance than grace. Her steps were sharp and quick, heels clicking against the floor like the ticking of a clock. Even before she reached the first rows, I could hear her muttering under her breath about delays and incompetence. Passengers shifted aside to let her pass. Sensing a storm brewing, she marched down the aisle with the kind of energy that said, "The world revolves around me." The flight attendants smiled politely, offering their usual greetings, but she didn't even acknowledge them. She didn't look left or right. Her eyes were locked on something ahead. That something was James. She stopped abruptly at his row, her body stiff with indignation. Passengers around her froze, waiting for what would happen. Then, in a voice so sharp it cut through the low hum of the cabin, she barked, "That's my seat." The words rang out like an alarm. Heads turned. Even from where I sat, several rows back, I could hear the tension in her tone. James looked up, his brow slightly furrowed. He didn't raise his voice, didn't frown, didn't match her aggression. He simply glanced at his ticket, then at hers, then back again. "This is seat 2A, he said evenly. He held up his stub for her to see. "It's mine." Her eyes narrowed. She didn't even glance at his ticket. "No, that's my seat," she repeated, louder this time, as though sheer volume would make her claim true. The passengers around them grew still, their attention hooked like an audience waiting for a play to begin. You could almost feel the question hanging in the air. Would James give in, or would she? But the truth was, Karen wasn't mistaken. She wasn't confused by row numbers or seat letters. She was making a decision to claim something that wasn't hers, to test the system, to prove that her demands carried more weight than anyone else's rights. She didn't want the seat, she wanted control. James, however, was not the kind of man to be rattled by theatrics. He calmly slipped his ticket back into his jacket pocket and leaned slightly against the headrest. His silence was steady, firm. He was giving her space to realize her error, to back down gracefully. But she had no intention of backing down. I paid a fortune for this ticket, she snapped, her voice rising. And you're sitting in my place. Do you know who I am? I could see the smirk tugging at the corners of some passengers' lips. The dreaded phrase, "Do you know who I am?" was almost a parody of itself at this point. Yet Karen wielded it like a weapon, as though she expected it to open doors, silence objections, and bend people to her will. James didn't move. "I'm sure there's a mistake," he said calmly, "but it isn't mine." Her cheeks flushed red. She shifted her weight, glared at the flight attendant approaching, and then crossed her arms defiantly. Passengers whispered now. Some exchanged amused glances. Others raised their eyebrows in disbelief. A few quietly raised their phones, already sensing that this was a scene worth recording. The flight attendant smiled tightly, the kind of smile reserved for moments when patience is thin, but duty requires politeness. "Ma'am, may I see your boarding pass?" she asked gently. Karen didn't hand it over. Instead, she waved vaguely toward James's seat. "This is my seat. I shouldn't have to prove it." The attendant's smile didn't falter, but her eyes sharpened. "Ma'am, if you'll please show me your boarding pass, we can sort this out quickly." Passengers leaned closer, waiting. James remained calm, hands folded, eyes steady. He didn't need to argue. He knew the truth was on his side. Karen, however, had built her life, or at least her public mask, on being louder, sharper, and more forceful than anyone around her. She thought authority was about dominance, not fairness. And in that moment, she wasn't just fighting for a seat, she was fighting for the illusion that she mattered more than everyone else. The cabin buzzed with tension, and I sat frozen in my economy seat, watching it unfold. I knew James well, enough to understand he wouldn't be bullied, but I also knew Karen wasn't the type to give up without burning everything around her. The standoff had begun, and the plane hadn't even left the ground. The air inside the plane thickened, like everyone was holding their breath at once. Karen stood in the aisle, arms crossed, glaring down at James as though her sheer indignation could force him out of the seat. Her voice, sharp and piercing, broke the cabins.com again. "I am not moving until this man gets out of my seat," she shouted. Passengers turned fully in their chairs now, no longer pretending to ignore the scene. Some leaned into the aisle for a better view. Others pulled out their phones to record. It was becoming entertainment, a live drama unfolding before takeoff. I shifted in my economy seat, craning my neck to see James. He was still sitting there, calm as stone, his hands resting on the armrests as though nothing unusual was happening. The flight attendant maintained her professional tone, but I could see the tension in her jaw. "Ma'am, I need to see your boarding pass so we can resolve this." Karen sighed dramatically, as if the request itself were beneath her. Finally, she dug into her oversized handbag, rummaging loudly before pulling out a crumpled piece of paper. She handed it over with a smug look, certain it would prove her right. The attendant scanned it, her brow furrowed, then politely handed it back. "Your seat is 23B, ma'am," she said evenly. A murmur swept through the cabin. 23 rows back economy. Karen's face went red. "That must be wrong," she barked. "I paid for first class. This is my seat. Fix it." "I'm sorry, ma'am," the attendant replied, her voice firmer now. "Your boarding pass clearly states 23B. That is your assigned seat." Karen's eyes darted around, searching for support. Instead, she was met with raised eyebrows, smirks, and the quiet glow of phone screens capturing every second. Someone muttered, "Here we go," and a ripple of laughter followed. James didn't laugh, didn't gloat. He simply sat there, dignified, sipping from his water. His calmness was a sharp contrast to Karen's chaos, and that only seemed to infuriate her more. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" she hissed at him. "Sitting there like you own the place. Well, I deserve that seat more than you. I'm exhausted. I've had a terrible day. I can't possibly be shoved back there with—" She gestured wildly toward the economy section, all of them. Her words hung in the air, dripping with contempt. Passengers gasped. A man in row 3 shook his head in disgust. A woman across the aisle whispered, "Unbelievable." The attendant drew herself up taller. "Ma'am, you cannot speak about other passengers like that. Everyone has paid for their ticket, including you. You must take your assigned seat, so we can depart." But Karen wasn't listening. She leaned closer to James, invading his space, her finger jabbing the air inches from his face. "Get out of my seat right now, or I'll have you removed from this plane." Gasps erupted. Someone in the back actually clapped sarcastically. Phones were now openly recording, the little red dots of video capturing Karen's every word. James finally spoke, his voice soft but unshakable. "Ma'am, I'm not moving. This is my seat. Your argument is with the airline, not me." The restraint in his voice was almost unnerving. He didn't raise his tone, didn't match her volume, and somehow that only magnified the weight of his words. Karen faltered for a second, blinking at his composure, then quickly recovered, puffing herself up like a balloon about to burst. "Fine," she said, spinning toward the attendant. "Call your supervisor. I want him off this plane. Do you hear me off?" The attendant's patience finally cracked. "That's enough, ma'am. You need to lower your voice." But Karen only grew louder. She stamped her foot, pointed at James again, and shrieked, "If he doesn't move, I'm not flying. I will sue this airline. I will sue you. The cabin vibrated with tension. Babies stirred, children clutched their parents' arms, and adults exchanged wide-eyed looks of disbelief. It wasn't just an argument anymore. It was a spectacle. The head flight attendant arrived, her presence commanding more authority. She crouched slightly to meet Karen's eyes, her voice firm but calm. Ma'am, your seat is 23B. You need to go there now, or we will have to involve security. Karen gasped dramatically, clutching her chest like she was the victim of some terrible injustice. Security for what? Because I want the seat I paid for. You didn't pay for this seat, the attendant replied. Her tone clipped now. You paid for 23B. A laugh bubbled up from somewhere in the back. Karen whipped her head around, eyes blazing. Who said that? Who's laughing at me? But it was too late. The crowd had turned against her. Passengers weren't sympathizing. They were mocking, recording, and whispering. She was no longer in control. Desperate, she tried another tactic. She softened her voice, forcing a tremble into it. Look, she said, glancing at James with wide, pleading eyes. I have a medical condition. I can't sit in economy. The seats are too small. I'll get sick. Please, just let me have this one. For a brief second, the cabin quieted. It was almost convincing until the attendant asked, Do you have a doctor's note for your condition? Karen froze. Her mouth opened, then closed, then twisted into a scowl. I don't need to prove anything to you people, she snapped. The whispers resumed, harsher now. She's lying, someone muttered. Another voice said, Classic Karen. Karen's composure cracked further. She turned back to James, her voice rising again. If you were a gentleman, you'd give up your seat. But no, you just sit there smirking while I'm suffering. James shook his head slowly. I paid for this seat. I'm not moving. That calm refusal was the final straw. Karen lunged forward, her hand darting toward his jacket pocket where his boarding pass was tucked. Gasps erupted as her fingers brushed the fabric, trying to snatch it. James leaned back swiftly, pulling the stub out and holding it out of her reach. Enough, the head attendant barked. Sit down, ma'am, before this goes any further. But the situation had already gone too far. Karen's face was red, her breathing heavy, her voice shrill. She had demanded, threatened, begged, lied, and even tried to grab James's ticket all in front of a captive audience. And now security was on the way. The cabin buzzed with excitement and tension, everyone waiting to see how far tantrum would go. James stayed calm, his expression almost serene. He had seen enough of the world to know one truth. People who scream the loudest often fall the hardest. Karen, blinded by her entitlement, was about to find that out the painful way. The cabin seemed to hold its breath after Karen's attempt to snatch James's boarding pass. That single act had crossed an invisible line. Disruptions were one thing. Airlines dealt with complaints every day, but physical aggression, even something as small as grabbing for paper, turned the situation into something far more serious. The head flight attendant, still standing firm, immediately stepped back and signaled toward the front of the plane. It was a subtle gesture, but everyone understood what it meant. Security had been called. A ripple of anticipation moved through the passengers. Karen, however, either didn't notice or didn't care. She was still too caught up in her fury, too trapped in her belief that sheer force of will could bend reality to her liking. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, her face blotched with anger. I don't believe this, she snapped. You're all incompetent. I have flown with this airline for years, and I have never been treated this way. This is harassment. I demand compensation. The head attendant remained steady. Ma'am, I need you to return to your assigned seat immediately. Karen laughed bitterly, shaking her head. Do you think I'm going to squeeze into row 23 like some nobody? Absolutely not. I won't do it. I'm not moving. From here, passengers began openly murmuring now, the crowd turning restless. Some were annoyed at the delay, others amused by the spectacle, but all of them were united in their disbelief. A man a few rows behind James muttered loudly enough for half the cabin to hear. I just want to get to New York. Sit down already. Karen whipped around, eyes blazing. Excuse me, did you just tell me to sit down? How dare you? But before she could escalate further, two uniformed security officers appeared at the front of the cabin. Their presence was like a switch being flipped. The passengers straightened, conversations dropped to whispers, and even Karen faltered for a split second. The authority they carried was undeniable. Broad shoulders, clipped movements, radios crackling at their belts. They weren't here to negotiate. They were here to restore order, ma'am, one officer said firmly, stopping just short of her seat. You need to lower your voice. Karen's bravado wavered. Her eyes darted from one officer to the other, then back at James, as if hoping someone would suddenly declare her the winner. But no one did. Dozens of eyes bore into her. Recording devices still pointed in her direction. I was just trying to explain. She stammered, her tone shifting. There's been a misunderstanding. That man took my seat. I paid for this one. The officer held out his hand. Boarding pass. Karen hesitated. Slowly, reluctantly, she handed it over. The officer scanned it. then raised his eyebrows. He turned the stub so she could see row 23 seat B. That's where you belong. The words landed like a hammer. The truth was undeniable now, stamped on paper, spoken by authority. There was no angle left to twist, no excuse she could spin that would convince anyone otherwise. But Karen wasn't ready to surrender. There must be some mistake, she said, her voice trembling now with desperation instead of fury. I was supposed to be upgraded. I called the airline yesterday. They told me they'd fix it. The second officer shook his head. Ma'am, there is no record of that. This is your assigned seat. You have two options. Move to your assigned seat and complete this flight, or deplane now. Gasps rippled through the cabin. The threat was clear: comply or leave. Karen's eyes widened. You can't make me get off this plane. I paid for my ticket. You can't just throw me out like trash. The first officer's tone hardened. Those are the options. Choose now. The entire plane seemed to lean forward, waiting for her decision. Karen's face twisted with humiliation. For the first time, she seemed to realize just how badly the situation had spiraled out of her control. Her performance, meant to show dominance, had turned into a public shaming. I have rights, she shouted, though her voice cracked under the strain. I'll sue all of you. This is discrimination. But the words sounded hollow now, weaker than before. Passengers rolled their eyes. Someone in the back even laughed. The tide had turned completely against her. James remained silent, still, seated comfortably, his expression unreadable. He hadn't needed to raise his voice or argue. By simply standing firm and letting her unravel, he had exposed her entitlement for everyone to see. Karen looked at him one last time, her face red with rage and embarrassment. You think you've won, don't you? She spat. You think you're so superior, sitting there with your smug little smile. Well, enjoy it while it lasts. James didn't answer. He didn't need to. His calm silence was more powerful than any insult. Finally, with the eyes of the entire cabin fixed on her, Karen snatched her boarding pass back from the officer and we stomped down the aisle toward the back of the plane. Every step seemed heavier than the last, her heels clicking against the floor in angry rhythm. She shoved her bag into the overhead bin above row 23 and dropped into her seat with a dramatic huff. The officers lingered near the front for a moment, ensuring she was settled, then nodded to the flight attendants. The cabin exhaled collectively, as though everyone had been holding tension in their lungs for too long. A few passengers clapped quietly, then louder, until half the cabin was applauding. It wasn't for James, not really. It was for the relief that the storm had finally passed. James simply adjusted his seatbelt, took another sip of water, and glanced out the window as though nothing extraordinary had happened. His composure, unshaken from start to finish, only highlighted Karen's meltdown even more. From where I sat, I could see Karen slumped in her economy seat, her arms crossed tightly, her face turned toward the window. She refused to meet anyone's gaze, but she didn't need to. Everyone knew her face now, and many had captured it on video. The incident wasn't over, not yet. The humiliation had only just begun. The applause faded into quiet murmurs as the officers left the cabin, but the energy lingered. People were buzzing with whispered comments, shaking their heads, exchanging knowing glances. The plane should have been preparing for takeoff, yet the story of Karen had taken center stage. Everyone seemed to be waiting for what she would do next. James remained a picture of calm. He leaned back, scrolling through his phone as if nothing had happened, while a flight attendant refilled his water. From my seat further back, I marveled at how he could remain so composed, where most people would be rattled, flustered, or at least annoyed. James treated it like background noise, but Karen was far from finished. She sat rigidly in row 23, arms folded, chest rising and falling as though she were trying to hold her anger inside. Every few seconds she'd glance forward toward first class, her eyes narrowing on James like daggers. It wasn't enough that she'd been forced into a proper seat. Her pride demanded some kind of retaliation. It didn't take long for her to start again. Excuse me, she shouted, waving her arm wildly. Excuse me, flight attendant. I need to speak to a supervisor immediately. Groans spread through the cabin. Passengers who thought the ordeal was over now rolled their eyes, sinking into their seats. A mother nearby pulled her headphones over her ears. A businessman pinched the bridge of his nose. The same head flight attendant approached, patience wearing thin. Ma'am, we need to prepare for departure. What seems to be the issue? Karen's voice wavered between indignation and desperation. That man in first class, he stole my seat. He humiliated me in front of everyone. I demand that he be moved, or upgraded me to first class immediately. The attendant's smile vanished. Her voice turned clipped. Ma'am, we've already gone over this. Your seat is 23B. The gentleman is in his correct seat. If you cannot remain calm, you will be removed from this aircraft. A collective gasp rippled through the passengers. This was no longer a polite request, was the final warning. Karen froze for a moment. Her eyes darted around the cabin, taking in the stares, the smirks, the glowing phones, still recording. She realized she was cornered, but instead of surrendering gracefully, she tried a different tactic. Her tone softened, dripping with false sweetness. "Look," she said, resting a hand dramatically over her heart. "I've had such a difficult week. You don't understand how much this flight means to me. If that man were a decent human being, he'd switch with me. Can't you just ask him? Maybe he'll show some compassion." The attendant stood firm. "He has no obligation to give up his seat. Please sit quietly." Karen's face twitched. She turned in her seat, raising her voice once more so everyone could hear. "So that's it. You're telling me that I, a loyal customer, am less important than him. Do you know how much money I spend with this airline? This is disgusting service." A man across the aisle muttered. "Not enough money for first class, apparently." Laughter broke out around him. Karen whipped her head toward him, eyes blazing. "Shut your mouth," she snapped. "You don't know me." The laughter grew louder, echoing through the rows. People weren't afraid of her anymore. They were mocking her openly. The power she thought she had was gone, replaced by ridicule. Desperation surged in her voice. "Fine," she shouted. "If he won't move, then I'll just take another seat." And with that, she stood abruptly and marched back toward the front of the cabin. Gasps filled the air as she stormed down the aisle, her bag still in the overhead bin behind her. The attendants rushed to intercept her, but she was determined, moving quickly toward James's row. "Ma'am, stop," one of them ordered, but Karen ignored it. She reached James's row, slammed her hand down on the empty seat beside him, and declared loudly, "I'm sitting here. If nobody else will do the right thing, then I will." The entire plane erupted in chaos. Passengers shouted in disbelief, some laughing, others yelling for her to sit down. The attendants blocked her path, their voices sharp now. "You cannot sit here. Return to your seat immediately." James didn't even flinch. He remained seated. Watching the scene unfold as though it were a play written just for him. His lack of reaction only made her look more unhinged. Karen planted her feet stubbornly. "I refuse to sit in economy. I deserve this seat. What are you going to do? Drag me out?" The answer came quickly. The same two security officers reappeared, at the front, their expressions grim. The cabin hushed instantly, the laughter fading into a heavy silence. Everyone knew what was about to happen. "Ma'am," one officer said, his voice booming, "you were given clear instructions. You have refused to comply. You will now be removed from this flight." Karen's bravado cracked, her eyes widened in horror, her hands trembling slightly. No, you can't do that. Please, I have somewhere to be. I can't miss this flight." But it was too late. The officers stepped forward, each taking hold of one of her arms. She squirmed, shouting protests that grew weaker with each second. "This is harassment. I'll sue." All her words cut off as she realized her threats meant nothing now. The passengers didn't hide their reactions. Some clapped, some cheered, others filmed with wide grins on their faces. A few even called out, "By Karen, and enjoy economy next time." James simply looked away, his expression calm, almost bored, as if the whole ordeal had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Karen was marched down the aisle, her heels dragging against the carpet, her face red with humiliation. She tried to twist free, but the officers held her firmly. When she reached the front of the plane, she turned one last time, her voice breaking. "You'll regret this. All of you." No one believed her. The officers escorted her off the plane, and the cabin doors closed behind them. A hush followed, then a wave of relieved laughter and applause. The nightmare was finally over. The flight attendants moved quickly, restoring order, securing the cabin, and preparing for takeoff. The captain's voice came over the intercom, apologizing for the delay. His calm tone only highlighted how extraordinary the disruption had been. From where I sat, I caught a glimpse of James. He leaned back, eyes closed now, as though nothing unusual had happened. He looked utterly unbothered, and somehow that made the entire ordeal even funnier. Karen had screamed, argued, lied, begged, and finally been dragged out. And through it all, James hadn't lifted a finger. The truth was simple. Entitlement had crashed headfirst into reality, and Karen had lost. When the cabin doors sealed shut again, a collective sigh of relief rippled through the plane. It was as if a storm had passed and the skies finally cleared. People chuckled, exchanged comments, and stretched back into their seats, grateful that the chaos had ended. The air felt lighter now that Karen was gone, and the relief was almost tangible. I leaned back, watching the other passengers slowly return to normal. A man across the aisle muttered to his wife, "Never thought I'd see someone actually dragged off a flight." His wife shook her head in disbelief, whispering she brought that on herself. Conversations like that popped up in clusters throughout the cabin, snippets of shock, humor, and shared unity against the drama that had nearly derailed the trip. The attendants moved with quick professionalism, but even they couldn't suppress small smiles. One of them, the head attendant, who had stood her ground so firmly, finally exhaled with relief. Her voice came over the intercom, but laced with just a touch of amusement. "Thank you for your patience, everyone. We are now cleared for takeoff. Please ensure your seatbelts are securely fastened." As the engines roared and the plane began to taxi down the runway, I glanced up at first class. James hadn't moved at all. He still looked utterly unbothered, scrolling through his phone with the same ease he displayed throughout the ordeal. The fact that he hadn't risen to Karen's bait once, not even when she'd planted herself right beside him only, made him seem more dignified. It was as though Karen had been fighting a battle with herself all along, while James simply let the truth speak louder than her tantrums. Once we were airborne, the tension melted away completely. Drinks were served, movies flickered on tiny screens, and the hum of the engines became the background to the chatter of relieved passengers. A man 2 rows behind me raised his cup and joked, "Here's to the end of the Karen era." Laughter erupted again, this time warmer, less sharp, like the shared humor of survivors who had made it through something together. The best part, though, was the way strangers bonded over the drama. People compared their recordings of Karen's outbursts, swapping clips, replaying her shrill voice demanding, "That's my seat." Some passengers laughed so hard they nearly spilled their drinks. I had no doubt that by the time we landed, half the internet would know the story of a screaming woman who demanded a first-class seat and ended up being dragged off the plane. I couldn't help but think about Karen, though. Somewhere back at the terminal, she was probably still shouting at staff, blaming everyone but herself for her downfall. Maybe she was being rebooked on a different flight, or maybe she'd been banned altogether. Either way, her entitlement, that had cost her more than just her pride, had robbed her of her destination, her dignity, and any sympathy she might have had. James eventually caught me watching him. For the first time since boarding, he looked back and gave a small nod, almost like a silent acknowledgement. It wasn't smug or boastful, just a simple gesture that said, "Some things don't need fighting, truth handles it for you." I nodded back, feeling like I'd witnessed something far bigger than just a flight delay. Hours later, when we landed, the memory of Karen still lingered. Passengers gathered their belongings, chatting animatedly about what they'd just lived through. "You know this is going viral," one teenager said, holding up his phone with a grin. "She's going to be famous for all the wrong reasons." His friend laughed. "She wanted attention. Now she's getting it." As we exited the plane, a sense of camaraderie followed us into the terminal. People who had never met before shared smiles, jokes, and headshakes, bound together by a single outrageous event. Everyone had a story to tell now about the woman who screamed, demanded, lied, and ultimately lost everything in front of an entire plane load of witnesses. I walked with James for a short while through the terminal. He still looked unshaken, as if the whole ordeal barely registered. Finally, I couldn't resist asking, "You really didn't let it bother you, did you?" He gave a quiet chuckle. "Why would I? People like that, they destroy themselves. All you have to do is let them." That answer stuck with me long after we parted ways. Karen had tried everything: intimidation, fake tears, demands, even desperation. But in the end, none of it mattered. Entitlement without respect has no power. And respect, as James had shown, comes from patience, dignity, and knowing when silence speaks louder than shouting. By the time I reached baggage claim, my phone was already buzzing. Social media feeds were exploding with clips from the flight. Headlines blared entitled, "Passenger removed after screaming for first-class seat," and "Plane erupts as Karen gets dragged off." Karen had gotten what she wanted, attention, but not in the way she imagined. Instead of admiration, she became a warning, a cautionary tale, proof that screaming for what isn't yours only makes you fall harder when reality finally hits. And as I walked away with my luggage, I couldn't help but smile. She had demanded the world treat her like royalty, but in the end, the world treated her exactly as she behaved, like a tantrum-throwing child. That was Karen's legacy, and for the rest of us on that flight, it was a story we'd never forget.